These are what I'll have to call the crazy days of the Congress and of what's going on in Washington.
There are lots of issues from an energy policy standpoint that needs to be addressed that mergers and acquisitions just by themselves do not necessarily solve.
Be prepared for some interesting, maybe exotic transactions, maybe some very stupid transactions.
In looking at a merger today as a CEO, I think I'd look at all the stakeholders in it, and I would expand the horizon from just the shareholders.
I think you've got to explain to your people why bigger is better.
Most mergers are a bad deal for the shareholders. Most mergers are a bad deal for the culture, and they're a really good deal for the investment bankers getting large fees. I'm the last person to begrudge large fees.
ExxonMobil, ConocoPhillips, Total Fina Elf, now known as Total. We're so familiar with these names today that it's easy to forget that they are the product of mergers, acquisitions, and joint ventures. The supermajors may be the most visible of the joint ventures, but they're just 3 of more than 2,600 mergers that took place in the petroleum industry from 1991 through 2000. Welcome to World Energy Television. I'm Roger Smith. Around the world, competition has never been stronger, and the search for oil and gas to satisfy our growing economy takes some scale. In an industry as diverse as ours, positioning is critical. Having the right technology is very important, and we have an ever-shrinking pool of qualified individuals as our workforce ages. Our largest supermajor, ExxonMobil, ranks toward the bottom of the top 20 producers worldwide. Today we ask, how big is too big? And how can we ensure that our industry comes together in such a way that they can provide the resources that we need? Joining us in the studio today are John Gibson, President and CEO of Paradigm; Neville Henry, Chief Exploration Officer of Buccaneer Resources; David Johnson, Energy Practice Leader of Protiviti; John Olson of Sanders Morris Harris. And via satellite, joining us in the studio, let's welcome Tom Fry, Executive Director of NOIA, and Matt Simmons, the Chairman of Simmons & Company International. So this is a big industry. So John Olson, tell us, are mergers good for the energy industry?
I think that to answer the question, you almost have to go on a case-by-case basis. I think that there have been some successful mergers, but there have been some which people would like to forget about.
Okay, let's go to Matt Simmons and get his thoughts on mergers. Matt?
It's the world's largest industry, so it's not just this is a big industry. And to a certain extent, when we had the awful collapse in oil prices, to survive, you had to be lean as can be, and so through consolidation, you could basically, take 15 and make it to 2 in your cost structure. Out of that came the survival of the oil service industry. But in the oil and gas industry, as we created mega majors, we created companies that were far too big to ever find oil by the drill bit, because they were just too big.
Well, John Gibson, do you think mergers are good for this industry?
Well, the mergers aren't increasing the number of reserves. They are consolidating reserves so that we get a chance to gain some economies of scale and scope in some situations where you can reduce costs through consolidation of finance departments, HR, IT, etc. But is it fundamentally adding to the reserves that are available? The answer is no. And is it improving the economics of some of the reserves that are currently discovered and being produced? And I'd say that the answer in most cases is yes.
David Johnson, what do you think about these?
You're really looking at value, and you're looking at the ability to service your customers in any industry, not just the energy industry. And so every time I look at one of these, I look at what types of value can be created, and not just in the short term.
As the president of a trade association, one member is never better than 2. That being said, though, I think I have to agree with John. I'm not sure that the mergers are either good or bad for the industry, because it doesn't ultimately find additional hydrocarbons. I think you have to look on a case-by-case basis whether or not it worked out better for the stockholders, whether or not an individual company was able to grow their reserves. But I think from a big picture standpoint, they probably don't have a whole lot of effect on the industry as a whole.
Well, I think if you look at the overall picture, I would believe that they've actually destroyed long-term value. That there's been a focus on surviving the merger for the first 5 years, and we forget about doing any future exploration, any future research and development in saving dollars to protect the merger.
What is the difference between consolidation in the service industry versus consolidation of the operators?
Oh, it's probably one of the tougher questions to talk about from an industry perspective. But if we tried to back up and look at it in a macroscopic way, I think the thing that's readily apparent to all of us is that the service sector is significantly smaller. So we've evolved an industry now to where the competition in the service sector is narrowed down to 3 or 4 players, while the competition in the E&P sector is tremendous. And I think you have to look at that. Any further consolidation in the oil field service sector, I think, could be detrimental to the industry with regard to pricing, with regard to the ability to have continued innovation, because I think some of the problems of size is that it is not necessarily conducive to great innovation.
So let's also get Matt Simmons' insight on this consolidation question. Matt?
Well, the consolidation in the service industry did a whole bunch of beneficial things. It isn't the end-all be-all, but it created quite a few companies that had enough critical mass to be able to operate in 90 countries around the world. If we'd have left the oil service industry totally fragmented, then we'd have a very, very inefficient oil service industry. It's allowed the industry to basically be able to recruit for scarce resources, people, in as many as 100 countries. That's really important.
I think Matt's got a point. The service industry has provided a lot of support through the development of the technologies and things that we've needed. It's been able to access people around the world, which, thank goodness, has provided talent into our business recently that we haven't been able to generate from our own schools. So I believe that the service industry, the consolidation has been good. As a user of the service industry, though, I like to have a lot of competition, because I think getting different ideas to solve some of our technical problems from different perspectives in the service industry has been a great value add to our various ventures in different parts of the world with different problems.
Thanks, Neville. Now, coming up after the break, what drives these mergers? Is it always a result of how big a company is? We'll find that out, plus what makes for a model merger, acquisition, or joint venture. Stay with us. You're watching World Energy Television. Welcome back. Big is not always the driving factor. So what is the mark of a model merger, acquisition, or joint venture? Let's go to Matt Simmons.
Well, first of all, I don't think size has anything to do with quality. You know, I'm biased because Simmons and Company is a very small investment banking firm compared to the mega firms we compete with that don't add any value. I think we do. Hunt Oil Company, privately owned company, they're probably the most efficient oil company in the world. And they have a model that used to be people are our most important asset. They've now changed it to culture as our most important asset. So I think that that's the critical mass issue, is do you have a culture that is so enjoyable that it stimulates creativity, so therefore you have the best people, and the best people will figure out a way out of a mess twice as fast as average to mediocre people.
So we've talked about these vital factors, the culture, the technology, the assets. So which is the most important consideration in this merger, acquisition, or joint venture? John Gibson, you're the one. Tell us.
People, and people. If you're able to put the two groups together and maintain enthusiasm, motivation, and focus on the vision of the company, you'll be successful. You can take good people and a bad idea and have a success, but a good idea and bad people, it results in failure. So people, and then that long-term vision.
Well, yeah, you say that, but the first thing out of the chute is we lay off the first thing we do when we merge, we lay off, how many tens of thousands of employees or some number of employees for the benefit of getting us down to a good value proposition. So the motivation aspects are immediately challenged. So your people are down when you want them at the most opportune time to be moving forward.
David, culture, technology, asset.
The people side of the equation is really hard. I worked with an organization that merged, and 2 years after the merger, sitting on one floor, they still had the groups from the separate companies sitting separately on the floor and not communicating together, not working together, not doing any of the things that you need to do to really drive value out of it. And so I think people too easily get focused on, how do I combine these systems and how do I combine these fields? And they get rid of a bunch of people when they're not really focused on, how do I make this exciting for the people? How do I build a culture within this new organization that brings it to life for folks so that they can really get behind the vision that the executives have for the merger in the first place?
I think that's going to be one of the biggest challenges for CEOs in mergers and consolidation, which I agree are inevitable, is how do you actually get one culture out of 3 or 4 cultures? Because if you're not able to, you're never able to really take advantage of the best practices. You're never ever able to take advantage of the really great pieces from each of the different companies and dispose of the bad ones.
That's right.
Now, is that a problem that comes because we still have ExxonMobil and the names all kind of linked, so we don't have we still are our own company within a company?
I think it makes it hard. I mean, I like the Total Elfina consolidation to just Total or Chevron. I was a Gulf person, so I guess it should be Chevron Texaco Gulf. But honestly, it's Chevron, and Chevron has a great culture, and they should really take that core culture, and if you're the acquirer, I think you have to bring the cultures together to be one.
Well, we know that in the oil and gas business, companies are judged on the value of their reserves. Now, when companies combine, what are some of the issues that need to be evaluated? John Olson.
Oh, I think that would require an answer that might take all afternoon.
Well, we don't have that much time, so.
I think that just to begin with, though, and to summarize, clearly the asset quality, clearly the people quality, the oil and gas reserves, to render them as transparent as possible. Coming from Wall Street as I do, I am amused to see that most analysts and portfolio managers and the like never have any access to the reserve reports. For instance, you get a summary or a footnote in the annual report, that kind of thing, but you never see just how the decline curves look overall for the company. And I suspect that if analysts were to see a lot of this data, that they would have a lot of second thoughts about the valuations they put on some of these companies.
Matt, what are some of the best practices and maybe some of the worst practices for